We're turning back to those verses that we read, and the verses are Isaiah chapter 51 and verses 17 to 23. The title for the message this evening is A Time to Awake. A Time to Awake. This prophecy of Isaiah is becoming more and more applicable to the moment we are in. The church is asleep. Many of the pastors are asleep. There is more than ever a need for a spiritual wake-up call. That is what this passage is. It is a call to awake, a call to arise out of the sleeplessness of sin, the folly of sin, the darkness of sin, to awake to the righteousness of God. I want to consider with you 4 points in this passage. I want to look at a call, or the call, to awake in verse 17, the condition to astonish in verses 18 to 20, thirdly, the comfort of the Almighty in verses 21 and 22, and then fourthly, the confounding of the adversary in verse 23. So first of all, the call to awake in verse 17. Notice first of all, it is an emphatic call and an emphasized call. It's stated twice for emphasis. It is awake, awake. Arise, we could say. And we have this double emphasis used 3 times in close proximity in these verses. We have it back in verse 9. It is awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. And then in the next chapter in verse 1, it is awake, awake, put on strength, O Zion. This double emphasis only found 3 times in Isaiah, and all within short compass of this particular verse. Paul uses this image in the following exhortations in 3 letters in the New Testament. First of all, in Romans 13, verse 11, he says, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. And then in 1 Corinthians 15:34, awake to righteousness and sin not. And then lastly in Ephesians 5 and verse 14, wherefore he saith, awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. Awake. That's what we need to hear. More than that, that is what we need to do. That is what the church, and this call in the Old Testament in our present passage, but also in the New Testament, the church is central, or the call is centrally and primarily and really to the church. The people of God need to awake. The people of God need to realize the time. That there's enough time in sleepness, in being asleep. There's enough time in being drowsy in sin. We must wake up. It is awake, awake, but then it's a call to stand. It is stand, O Jerusalem. Again, it's the people of God. It's the city of God. We'd understand, wouldn't we, that if the call was to the world in general, but here the call, the need of the moment, the need of the hour is to God's people, to God's city, to the city of God, as Augustine used that phrase. It's time to awake, time to arise. Again, Paul uses this imagery. 1 Corinthians 16:13, watch, stand fast in the faith. Quit you like men, be strong. And one other in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 11, he says, put on the whole armour of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. In verse 13, having done all to stand. Verse 14, stand therefore, and so on. It is awake and then stand, not just awake and then lie in bed and have a rest. No, it's awake and stand up with purpose. And the purpose is to realize the Word of God, to recognize God's call, and to respond to God's call. But then notice also in this verse, to whom the call is made, we said that already, it's to Jerusalem, but then the context and the need, which has drunk at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury. Jerusalem had consumed, as it were, the cup of God's fury. They had become drunken at the dregs of the cup of trembling, and they wrung them out. Jerusalem had been laid low under the hand of judgment. It was a full and complete judgment. This captivity, this Babylonian captivity that still hadn't taken place as yet, this is prophetic. But it was going to be 7 years of full and complete judgment. And consider this, without this call, that's where they would have remained. We see that in history when God judges nations, including the northern kingdom of Israel, he judges them and they remain. They are gone under the hand of God's judgment. But now comes the effectual call to arise from this condemnation, from this fury, from the cup of trembling of God's judgment. We need God's effectual call.